Welcome to Monetize Your Message, where we're helping you develop strategies to build a consistent message and achieve your business goals. I'm Marie.
And I'm Jessie, and today we're going to be talking about how to be personal without oversharing, because personal storytelling is really important. And if you watched our last episode, we delved a little bit into why stories are important for your business, but there is always this kind of risk or hesitance of oversharing and talking too much about your personal life and not necessarily drawing it enough into business. And some people just don't like sharing their personal life at all. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how to tackle that within your business so that you can incorporate stories in a way that feels good to you.
Exactly. So we've come up with a few guidelines for you guys, and we're going to delve into each. We want to just start off with probably what's the most important one, which is setting your personal boundaries. Do you want to be clear that you can change these boundaries over time, but set some to begin with. So maybe that means that there's a particularly painful part of your life that you don't really want to get into and share with people, or there's something, especially anything that involves other people, and you don't have permission to use their stories. That's super important to be able to set those boundaries and to know that if you're being vulnerable about yourself, and you're choosing that, and you can make that decision as an adult and as a business owner. And you can get as personal as you want about that, and you can get as raw and vulnerable as you want about that. But when it comes to other people's stories, tread lightly, get permission. That's always sort of the safest way to go for it. But definitely when it comes to yourself, get permission from yourself as well. Think about the things that you want to share, and think about the things that you definitely don't want to, and draw that into your strategy.
Yeah, and I've seen that a lot of bloggers do this, for example, with their personal families and whatnot. So, for example, if you want to share a personal story that involves your children, but you don't want to give your children's names out, they put the first initial of their name or something like that. Whatever the boundary may be for you, just giving yourself the permission to set those boundaries. Maybe you don't want to involve anything with your kids in your business. You don't ever want to talk about them. Maybe you don't ever want to talk about your significant other because you want a very clear separation between business and personal. Or maybe that's a big part of sharing your life. Maybe that is a part of your business, but you want to set boundaries around how you share it. So maybe it's only in Instagram posts on this one account, whereas in Facebook or on the website, it looks different. Or maybe it's I'm only going to share these certain personal stories, whereas these other ones are going to be off limits, at least for right now, and I might reevaluate later.
Exactly. So there's sort of no hard and fast rule about this. It's just important to have that conversation with yourself and with other people who might be impacted. Next up, this one is a little bit hard, especially for people who love telling stories and who really, really resonate with the details. Like, for instance, whenever I am thinking back on a conversation I have a really good memory for exactly where I was in that moment, what everything looked like, where I was geographically on this planet. But that's not great, because when you bore people with details, the story gets lost. So tip number 2, don't be overly detailed. You want to hit the high points of your story. Think about it. I don't know if you remember those charts in school where you have kind of like the rising action, the climax, and then the denouement, to put it really, really simply. But think about those high points. What are the high points in those stories, right? Think back to like a favorite story of yours and think about what those are. Can you tell the story in just 2 to 5 sentences? Okay, great. If you can squish a 2-hour movie or something into 2 or 3 sentences, then probably you can squish your personal story into that as well, at least the high points of it, and center the important bits and the emphasis around those.
Yeah, and sort of the line to walk here is there are certain amounts of detail that detract from the story, and there are certain amounts of detail that enhance the story. So back when I was in the classroom and I was teaching, one of the things that I worked on with my students a lot was incorporating sensory detail into stories. So looking at the senses, what do you see, what do you taste, what do you smell? And in some instances, it's really important to incorporate those elements because it helps bring the scene to life. But I think in the context of your business, it's important to look at the end point and the purpose of the story you're telling. So if the purpose of the story you're telling is to paint a really vivid picture, then you want to look at some of the details. But if the purpose of the story is simply to elaborate upon a point within your business, or on, for example, we would tell a lot of stories about our connection with community when we were selling one of our mastermind programs. And that was because it was relevant. Our mastermind program was a community. We'd had experiences with communities. We would share stories about that. We wouldn't necessarily share all of the sensory details of our community gathering or community building experiences because it wasn't necessarily relevant to the end goal. However, if we are telling a story that is really focused in on one specific moment, the details may become more important.
Exactly. So again, there's a fine line here. But the other thing I would say that is a good time to use detail is if you've ever taken any kind of storytelling course, you've probably heard this phrase before, show, don't tell. Mm-hmm. And what that's all about is instead of saying, I was nervous, say, my stomach clenched and my palms were sweaty. Okay, so that is some detail, definitely. It's that sensory detail that Jesse was talking about. But, and it also kind of gives that vulnerability that we were talking about in the prior point without being too personal and oversharing. But it's a nice way to say I was nervous without actually saying I was nervous. Your audience can infer that. So just keeping it at one or two things is a nice way to do that instead of literally describing every kind of physiological symptom you're having of being nervous. I think that's the key, like limiting the number so it's not just like a laundry list of things.
Which sort of leads into the next point, which is to embrace the micro story. So micro stories are little bitty stories, little bitty moments that have a big impact or a big lesson attached to them. So you don't necessarily have to have this big grand Cinderella story or fairy tale story or this huge impactful thing that happened. Instead, you can look at the small moments, the little details of life that lead to those big changes over time. So again, when I was teaching, I did a unit on memoir with my students, and these were a bunch of 16-year-olds, and they would often come to me and be like, I can't do a memoir, and it was a memoir paper, so they just had to choose one thing to write about. But their hang up was, I'm 16. I haven't had anything important happen to me in my life. I don't know anything. I don't have anything to write about. But what we worked on was the micro story. How is something super small, like deciding to try out for track, or deciding to write your first story, or taking care of your sibling? How do those very small everyday occurrences actually make you the person you are, or make your business the business it is?
Yeah, it's true. And remember that no matter how inexperienced you feel, whether just in life in general or in your business, every single person has gone through that who's been on the same track. I mean, everybody's been through childhood who's now an adult. Everybody who now has a six-figure business once literally just was trying to think of what they might name this thing and thinking about maybe potentially starting up. So these are very relatable experiences that you've had, even though they're unique to you. So that's the thing, is like when you share a micro story that is unique to you, if you can tie it in with your business or whatever the point is you're trying to make, it will totally resonate with people. So for instance, one of my micro stories is when I first actually started to believe that I was entrepreneurial. And it was during the summers and holidays during college and high school. I used to work at a little local local shop in my hometown in North Carolina. And on my very last little session working there, the owners actually approached me and asked me if I might be interested in buying business. I don't know if I even told you this story, Jesse.
I've never heard this story, no. I'm like fascinated.
And my immediate reaction was like, no, because I could not even imagine owning a business, much less like a successful shop, like a big shop, in my hometown. And later I thought about it. My answer was still no, but for different reasons. But it really did get the wheels turning. And it made me think, maybe they're seeing something in me that I haven't recognized in myself. And it was at that point at which I started to believe myself to be capable of being a successful business owner. That was like the turning point. So maybe you've had a turning point as well, where you suddenly realized, yes, I can do this. Or maybe you've always known it. And you sort of love to hear stories like this because it's funny to see other people recognizing things in themselves that you've always known about yourself. But sharing a micro story like that can be a fun way to connect with people, but it's still kind of like an interesting tidbit about me.
Yeah, and sometimes the micro story isn't even a moment, it's a habit or something that occurs regularly. So if you always knew you were entrepreneurial, or you always knew that this was the path for you, why? What in your life actually is a living example of that? So for example, I've always known that I'm a writer. I've always known that that is a part of who I am. From the first day I could pick up a pencil and write, I was writing. And so a micro story around that is the fact that I've had a journal since I was 6 years old, and I've kept journal after journal after journal, and made writing a occasionally frequent, occasionally infrequent habit of mine, but I always go back to it. And so that's a very small piece of my daily routine that I've been cultivating since I was 6 years old. And it's really important to me. And it also is a kind of testimony to the fact that a part of my identity is being a writer.
Exactly. Okay, and this identity is so tied up in this next point, which is emotion. Don't forget the emotion. When you think about your identity, when you think about these micro stories, the reason these sort of personal markers keep coming up for you and seem to be fertile ground for cultivating stories is because there's usually emotion tied with them. Neither one of us really ever even identify as particularly emotional, although I'm starting to actually turn that around personally. But even within that, it doesn't mean we're robots. Nobody is a robot. Everybody feels something, and maybe the feeling is shoved down. But the truth of the matter is, when you allow that emotional response that you had to be a part of your story, other people will feel those emotions as well. They will feel maybe different emotions. They might feel, excitement for you, or they might feel frustration sort of on your behalf, or all sorts of things. But they may also have an emotional reaction to your story, which is not identical to the emotion you were feeling and conveying through your story. But the truth of the matter is, people love relationships, people love stories, and so much of the reason behind that is because of the emotion, the attachment. And that is just such a nice way to pave that connection, which is actually our next point, but I'll hold off in case you have anything to add on that, Jesse.
Yeah, so in terms of emotions, I think this is one of the hardest things for a lot of people, but it's also one of the most powerful places for you to anchor your story. Because even if the details of the story differ from person to person, emotions are universal. Everyone feels them. Some people may hide them more or be better at ignoring them, but they all exist. Everybody's looking at me like,
we're like
you're
pointing
talking
fingers at each other.
But no, I think it's really, really powerful. And just a kind of quick anecdotal story about that is, for me, a very emotional kind of transformation that I've gone through over the past maybe 3 years or so was around the topic of introversion and embracing that within myself, and within myself as a business owner, but also within myself as a person. And so the micro story that that's attached to was reading the book Quiet by Susan Cain, which really allowed me to realize that as an introvert, excuse me, as an introvert, it's okay to want to take time to myself, and there's nothing wrong with me, which when I was a teacher was absolutely I felt like I was wrong somehow, because I was always burnt out. I was always exhausted. Well, of course I was. I was talking to 250 people every day and standing in front of them and performing for them. So that one experience of reading that book allowed me to realize that I was okay. And that was an emotional turning point for me because it allowed me to reshape how I perceived myself as a person, which then tied into my business and allowed me to create boundaries for myself and create systems for myself that honored my introversion instead of trying to push through it. And in all of the times I've talked about it with people on podcasts or in workshops, the connection isn't necessarily the topic. It isn't necessarily the story. It's the emotion behind it. And I've had people come up to me and say, I never knew that it was okay to just be myself. I never knew that it was okay to feel burnt out at the end of the day. And it was the emotional mirror that they saw where they could see themselves in my story. And that point came up through the emotional connection.
Yeah, Jesse's right. It's so important and it's so powerful. And I think it really does lead in beautifully to our final point, which is all about finding those connection points. So there's sort of two sides to this. One is connection where you are connecting with the people you're talking to, the people who are reading or listening to or somehow taking in your story, but also the connection between your story and your point. So it's really important to remember both of those things, but I'll launch first into the connection between you and your audience. So there's two levels to this. There's sort of the superficial connection points where I might say something like, I love Harry Potter, I love hiking, or, Jesse, you've got your chant.
Yes, OH. And only people from Ohio will know how to finish that. I mean, you can probably figure out how to finish it, but...
Yeah, exactly. And so somebody might say, oh, I'm from Ohio too. Or, oh my gosh, I also love silly children's lit, which is not silly at all. It's totally amazing. Or whatever the case may be. And they will connect just on a sort of like superficial level, but that's okay that it's superficial because that opens the door to a relationship. But there's also these deeper connection points where you have maybe experienced something in common, like going through the anxiety of quitting a job and then sort of the elation that follows and nervousness and all of that stuff. And talk about emotion, right? Like it's all up in there. Both of us really have a strong desire to live the life we want, which includes a life of significant amounts of travel, of self-care, of those kinds of things that are important to us, and being able to connect with people around those kinds of desires for what their actual life should look like, not just their business. That's deep, and that goes deeper than just, oh, I want to make $100,000. And I mean, that can be important too, if it facilitates something, right? If it means, and I paid off my college debt with that, or whatever it is, there's like these deep connection points. And that comes through vulnerability. It comes through telling those like whys that are below the surface of things like, I like to hike. What is that about? Well, it's about wanting to travel. Well, what's that about? Just keep digging deeper. Well, that's about like having a fulfilling life and feeling healthy and energized in my business. Okay, well, what's that about? Well, I want to love my, you can just go forever down these rabbit holes. And I think they're great rabbit holes to go down because people will connect every step of the way.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to ask that question of so what? And we talk about that a lot with just plain copywriting and marketing and whatnot. If you tell someone that you're offering them something, well, so what? Why do they care? But that applies to stories too. So if you're trying to find a story to tell to your audience, well, ask yourself that so what question. Why is it important? What is the connection point? Either whether it's one of those superficial connection points that starts a relationship, or whether it's deeper and connects to some sort of end goal or connects to some sort of emotion. Why is it an important story for you to tell in your business? And I think sometimes we feel like we just have to share personal stuff to share personal stuff because we're supposed to. And when it's approached from that perspective, it feels kind of invasive and gross almost. But when it's approached from the perspective of I'm sharing something that will connect not just point A to point B, but person A to person B, that's when it becomes really meaningful. And that's when you can look at your stories more objectively and say, okay, these are the stories that are the best stories to create those connections.
Exactly. And think about why you're even telling this story. Are you telling the story just to sort of reveal more of yourself and to be visible? Are you telling this story to lead people towards an offering eventually, or what's the purpose of this? As an entrepreneur, it's, you know, maybe you also just love to write personal essays and just get a kick out of that on the side. But if there's also a way to use that to grow your business, you know, that's really important to think about. What is your end goal here? And especially people who are really talented writers can feel, sometimes I feel like, oh, well, you know, I can kind of just make this point and then my reader can kind of infer what I want them to do. And I think that may be true if your audience is full of English majors who are really good at like literary analysis. But you have to remember that that may not be your audience. Think about who's reading this. Think about who's listening to this. And go ahead and draw that line for them. Chances are, yeah, it may not feel quite as like subtle and like artistically wowzers, but the truth of the matter is, like, if you go ahead and make that connection for somebody to whatever it is that you want them to take away from it, you have a better chance of them taking that away, right? Obviously, you want them to be able to draw their own thoughts and be able to sort of ruminate on it and to have a meaningful story. That's certainly something that happens. I love musicals, and one of my very favorite musicals is Into the Woods by Stephen Sondheim. And I was in a group once that performed it, and during one of the rehearsals, I just started going around asking people, like, to you, what is the moral of this story? And like every person had a different answer. It was amazing. And that's part of why I think it's like such a rich and complex, wonderful story. But it's interesting because if Stephen Sondheim had been creating that story for a specific purpose, if he had one goal in mind, that was not accomplished. If he had many goals in mind, that was. So think about it. What is your goal? Or do you just kind of want people to kind of take from it what they will? It's really important to think about that and to draw that connection for them if you want that connection drawn.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which, by the way, that was a really great micro story talking about how much you love musicals and whatnot. So a good example of just, you know, using our own experiences to elaborate upon a point. So quickly
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I'm going to pat myself on the back.
Good job, me.
Exactly.
So to quickly recap, we are in the context of personal storytelling without being overly personal and overly sharing. We are talking about how to set personal boundaries. We talked about how to be detailed and incorporate sensory detail, but not to be overly detailed. How to not forget emotion because everyone feels, and you want to embrace the feels and share the feels because other people feel probably pretty similar things to you, even if the story itself is different. And to find connection points, whether they are seemingly superficial connection points that open the door to relationships or meaningful connection points that actually connect your story to a specific end goal. So exactly. I would love to challenge you guys to think up a micro story of your own, a small story that creates a connection point, and share it in the comments. We would love to read some of the stories of your own experiences and how they led you to where you are and what is meaningful to you. And also any questions that you have about personal storytelling and how to incorporate it in your business without oversharing.
Exactly. All right. Hope this was helpful for you guys. And that's a wrap.